Now we'll look at disorders of visual perception and the problem of the final integration of all of the different aspects of vision, the what and the where, for example. One condition that can happen is something called prosopagnosia. This is a condition involving poor face recognition ability. Face recognition is part of the parvocellular system involved in recognizing objects. And in a sense, a face is just a very specialized object that humans have a particularly good ability to detect differences in, and it allows us to recognize individuals based on relatively small differences in their face. So the fusiform face area, the FFA, especially on the right side of the brain, is associated with the processing of faces and the proper recognition of faces. There's a genetic link to deficits in frontal and temporal lobes in a small number of cases of individuals with prosopagnosia. So prosopagnosia can run in families. In addition, brain damage can also result in prosopagnosia. Prosopagnosia occurs in roughly 1% of the population that suffers from the congenital form. In other words, the one that runs in families. And there was this really interesting study called the Greenville Study. These are greebles. So this is what the researcher did in order to study face recognition in humans, but she wanted to see if the FFA can learn to recognize something else, a different type of face. So kind of see how the FFA learns to recognize faces from the very beginning. And so she developed these individual greebles. They have very similar characteristics, just like people have typically, 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth, and a particular type of shape of the face. But there are small differences, just like we would have small differences in the distance between our 2 eyes and the shape of our eyes and the shapes of our nose and so on. And so the greebles also had these small differences. And individual participants learned to recognize these individual greebles. And as they did so, she discovered that the FFA became more and more active as they became better equipped to be able to recognize these faces. So she identified that the FFA is certainly capable of learning how to recognize faces, in individual faces. Now, another condition that can develop typically after brain damage is called blind sight. This involves damage to V1, the primary visual cortex in the back of the brain, and it causes what's called cortical blindness. So this person has damage to the visual cortex. They develop what's called a scotoma, and that creates like a blind spot. But what happens is that the individual still seems to react to things in an unconscious way without actually seeing them. And it's thought that this happens because the superior colliculus, if you remember, also receives visual information. The superior colliculus is in the midbrain, and the visual information goes from the eyes and also goes here, branch goes off to the superior colliculus for our visual reflexes. And so the idea is that this area is still getting that information. So even though we don't consciously see, the individual is still reacting in an unconscious way to things. And here's an example. So this face of a frightened woman is shown on the blind side. In other words, the part of the visual field that the person cannot consciously see. And yet, if we record their reaction to the face, for example, noticing their facial movements, we'll see that the person will react as if they were looking and they were seeing a frightened face. So they don't consciously see it, and yet they react to it. Here we're going to be able to see an example of blind sight. This individual has cortical blindness resulting from damage to visual cortex, and you can see he is avoiding a series of objects that the researchers placed in the hallway. He's going around them. No one's guiding him, no one's holding his hand or anything like that. He's just walking, even though he doesn't feel like he can see, and yet he's avoiding all of these objects. Interestingly, he reported that he thought he was walking in a straight line. He had no awareness of avoiding any objects or that there were any objects there to be avoided at all. Individuals can experience color agnosia, an inability to see color, movement agnosia, the inability to perceive movement. Movement agnosia is problematic because it's as if people are experiencing the world around them like it seems like it is under a strobe light. So you don't see continuous motion. And so, for example, if they were pouring a glass of milk, it would appear to suddenly be overflowing instead of gradually rising. If they were crossing a street and a car was coming towards them, they wouldn't be able to gauge when the car was going to arrive. Instead, it would just sort of seem as if the car was far away one moment and then the next it was upon them. Information about movement is integrated in an area called Area MT. Stands for medial temporal cortex, but I like it because it's easy to associate with movement, because if you were to abbreviate the word movement, you might be able to use the letters MT. There's a particular patient LM, who had damage to area MT. He had difficulty guiding eye and finger movements. So for example, to reach for something or to point towards something. He had difficulty telling if something or someone was moving, and he had a difficulty figuring out if objects were moving toward or away from him. In addition, another type of problem with visual perception involves something called neglect. And neglect in particular involves damage to the posterior parietal cortex, but on the right side of the brain. This area receives multisensory input from the visual, auditory, and somatosensory areas. Remember, the posterior parietal cortex is all about place. It's connecting the location of what we see, what we hear, what we touch, and as well, the position of our own bodies in the environment. And when the right posterior parietal cortex is damaged, the individual ignores the contralateral world completely. In other words, everything on the opposite side. So contralateral refers to opposite side. Ipsilateral refers to the same side. So everything on the opposite side of the world is completely ignored. So if the damage is on the right side, they're going to ignore everything on the left. When an individual with this type of damage is shown these pictures and then asked to draw them, this is what we get. They see a clock, they draw the clock, but without the numbers on the left. If they see a house, they draw the house, but it's missing the left window and the left wall. Drawing a flower, same thing. The left side of the flowers are missing. Your book has a cute example of an individual who has damage to this area and experiences neglect, and she only eats the right half of her plate of food, but she has now figured out that there's food on the left side of the plate, and so she will spin her wheelchair around, and by doing so, she'll put more of the plate of food on her right visual field as she comes around and spins around, and so she'll know there's more and she'll eat some more by doing that. Here's an example of a self-portrait an artist made before damage to the right posterior parietal cortex and then after. Now we can also look at the problem or the challenge of understanding the final integration of the visual system. And this is called the binding problem. And it's really more of a philosophical problem. It's figuring out how the brain combines information from different areas into an integrated experience. We don't really know how this happens. And it doesn't seem likely that we're going to figure it out definitively anytime soon. But if we think of perception so far, remember the IT is figuring out the object that we're looking at, is doing the object recognition. The parietal cortex is doing the location. And so someplace has to kind of put all this together. Some places where this might happen are the superior temporal gyrus that might combine location and object recognition because it receives input from both the dorsal and ventral streams. Could also be just the parietal cortex because remember damage there causes neglect. So that seems like to be a fairly whole representation. And the other possibility is the prefrontal cortex where both dorsal and ventral streams with the what and where of what we're seeing finally merge and decisions are made based on that. So any of these three areas could be places where we get a unified representation of an object's identity as well as its location. There is an interesting problem called synesthesia. This is kind of an issue that you can think of as being too much binding or overbinding. Synesthesia is where stimulation in one sense triggers an experience in another. So activity increases, for example, in a color area of the brain, V4, which is involved in color perception and color constancy. This area becomes more active when an individual with synesthesia speaks certain words. Why? Because for them, each of those words has a different color. For some people with synesthesia, numbers have particular colors. For some individuals, music, different notes of music will have different colors. For some individuals, a taste might be associated with the color as well. And so it's an example of how an experience that for most of us is only in one sense triggers this additional perception in another one. It's not a problem. It's not doesn't create any negatives. In fact, people that experience it find it enjoyable, or at least it's part of their experience, and they probably wouldn't want to be without it.